Good morning and welcome to this webinar on the subject of countdown to the expiration of the UN arms embargo on Iran, which is sponsored by United Against Nuclear Iran, which we call UANI, U-A-N-I. As co-chair of UANI, as chair of UANI, I am honored to welcome you here this morning. And to thank our panelists, which are really quite a remarkable group, Special Representative Brian Hook, Ambassador Nikki Haley, and Norman Roule. And I will introduce our founder, Mark Wallace, Ambassador Wallace, to introduce them in a few moments. UANI was founded by Mark Wallace together with Richard Holbrook and Dennis Ross, an experienced group of American statesmen, bipartisan, sharing an opinion, a consensus, which was that Iran represented a mortal threat to the security of the United States and our allies in the Middle East, an extremist regime supporting terrorists, terribly repressive of the human rights of its own people, expanding through aggression to the rest of the region. And the goal of UANI, when it was founded about a dozen years ago, to state it simply, was to prevent the Islamic Republic of Iran from becoming a regional superpower with nuclear weapons. And the means that UANI chose to reach that goal was primarily through economic pressure on the regime, supporting a wave of sanctions, which were adopted by members of Congress. I feel very proud that I was there to be part of that bipartisan support for economic sanctions against Iran, and then a tremendous bipartisan implementation, regardless of what party was in control of the administration. UANI chose a unique role here, which was to remind businesses throughout the world of their obligation to follow the terms of those economic sanctions against Iran, not to do business with Iran, or they would not be able to do business in the United States. And if they refused to comply, then to shame them or to disclose that they were not in compliance and bring down the force of the US power economically on them. That program really worked remarkably well to hurt the Iranian regime, the extremist terrorist Iranian regime. One of our goals was to see whether it was possible in passing these sanctions in Congress to bring the Iranians to a negotiation to, one, stop their nuclear weapons program, two, stop their support of terrorism, and three, rejoin the community of civilized nations. They didn't do any of that, notwithstanding that the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal of 2015, was negotiated and signed. In my opinion, our opinion, it was a terrible and I'd say tragic mistake in which we gave, and others, great powers around the world, gave the Iranians much too much for almost nothing. And we fought very hard, UANI, in Congress to try to block ratification and approval of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, but we failed. And we began to plan and strategize about and actually implement about how we were going to, in the context of the Iran nuclear deal, continue to put economic pressure on the Islamic Republic of Iran. And then came the Trump administration and withdrew the US from the Iran nuclear agreement. I thought a great decision in our national interest, our security interest, and then began to implement this campaign of maximum economic pressure against the Islamic Republic of Iran. It, in my opinion, has worked. The Iranian economy is a shambles. It's almost close to collapse. And that's just one of the problems Iran has now. The people of Iran are waking up and emboldened to see the corruption and incompetence of their government, particularly now as it responds to the COVID-19 pandemic and really is not helping them. They've never been at a lower, this regime has never been at a worse point in its 40 blood-stained years of rule over this great country, great civilization, great people of Persia and Iran. And that brings us now to the topic of the webinar. In the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement, there was a totally gratuitous, unearned, unnecessary, and dangerous give to the Iranians. It was part of Resolution 2231 in the United Nations Security Council, which called for the ending of the permanent arms embargo against the Iranian regime on October 18th of 2020. So here we are. And unless something is done, the Russians, the Chinese are now able to sell, will be able to sell arms to the Iranians, giving them a new breath of life and strength with which they can attempt to dominate their neighbors in the region and support the deadly work of terrorists in the region. The Trump administration tried quite correctly to get the United Nations Security Council to extend that October 18th deadline so the arms embargo would continue. The Iranians have done, this regime has done nothing to earn this gift. And it was defeated, as we know, in the Security Council. And if it is not extended in some way by world powers, either through the snapback that UANI supports, which the administration has said it would implement, or some other means, those who voted against the United States resolution at the UN Security Council are, in my opinion, enablers of the aggression, violence, terrorism, and death that Iran will bring to the region and the world if it can begin to buy arms and sell arms to others in the region and around the world. This is a turning point, an inflection point, and our willingness to be tough against the Iranians has, I think, given our allies in the Middle East, both in the Arab world and Israel, not only confidence, but as we saw just last week, the courage and vision demonstrated particularly by the United Arab Emirates, led by Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, to open diplomatic relations with Israel, a tremendous breakthrough. Frankly, at a moment in the world where there's very little positive happening, with all the challenges we're facing, this was a real burst of sunshine. It happens because I think we've been strong and our allies in the region know they can rely on us. And it makes clear that the real division in the region is not between the Israelis and Palestinians. It is a division, and we need to continue to deal with it and try to resolve it. But the most consequential division in the Middle East is that between the Islamic Republic of Iran and every other country in the region. And that's why it's so critically important that this embargo be extended. I want, before I turn it over to Mark Wallace, give a special thank you both to Brian Hook, President's Special Representative on Iran, for the extraordinary work he's done in implementing this turnaround, historically consequential policy of the administration toward Iran. And thank Ambassador Haley for her strength and eloquence and really steadfastness in support of this policy while she was at the United Nations and since. It's now my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Mark Wallace. As I said, he was the creator. He was not only there at the creation of UANI, he created it. And it has been a consistently bipartisan group since, witness the two of us, of course. And it is now a global force, really, with people from around the world on our advisory board. Mark has been principled, persistent, and even personable throughout all of this. And I'm proud to introduce him to you now as the moderator of today's program.
Thank you, Senator. It's a real privilege and honor. It's one of the highlights of for me to get introduced by the likes of Joe Lieberman. What an honor. And the best part about my job is I get to do, even virtually, panels and interactions with people like my old friend Brian Hook, my great friend Norman Roule, and somebody as wonderful and distinguished as Ambassador Haley. So it's a real privilege and honor to do this. Thank you all very much in these crazy, challenging times. It is interesting. We've been operating UANI now for well over a decade, and we're really at a 5-year anniversary of the JCPOA. And I wanted to mention briefly, because I think it's very apropos to the moment that we're in. 5 years ago, the JCPOA was founded on the premise that the United States could not engage in maximum pressure and sanctions alone. That without multilateral sanctions, we could not put economic pressure on Iran. And we believed at UANI that the United States could, in fact, impose maximum pressure on Iran without the benefit of the international community. And before somebody criticizes, it's always better, of course, to align as many allies as you can to any policy. But because of the key role of the American financial system, we were in a position, we believed, to put maximum economic pressure on Iran. And that point has been proven by the likes of Nikki Haley and obviously Brian Hook, who's done an exceptional job. Brian, I'm still jealous that you got to call tanker captains directly and ask them to come over to and deliver their oil to the United States instead of delivering it elsewhere. And Norman Roule, who obviously is such a capable, knowledgeable, really world-renowned intelligence expert on Iran. But the premise was wrong. The sanctions on Iran, the maximum pressure campaign, has been proven to work by the United States. And what we saw is some of the other premises of the JCPOA were ill-founded. There was a belief that Iran would rejoin the community of nations. It obviously hasn't. The JCPOA led to destabilizing conduct by Iran through its proxies and across the region. And the funding of Iran as part of the JCPOA was diverted from the likes to Hezbollah, to Yemen, and the like. And you saw an incredible amount of destabilization. And that's going to continue. And that money that was given to Iran, that floating of the economy, we've seen recently used to just not only just destabilize our allies, but target American troops. Recently, I think just today, it was announced that Iran was using bounties to target American troops through terrorist activities. Obviously, we heard reports of the Russians doing something similar, but now Iran, who, if there's any international mischief in the region, it can usually and most likely be traced to Iran. But we saw an extraordinary event recently that has been largely overlooked. Senator Lieberman mentioned it in his remarks. You had an extraordinary effort by the Gulf Cooperation Council through Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, the KSA, UAE, to express their profound opposition to the expiration of the arms embargo. They are Iran's neighbors. They are most vulnerable to Iran being armed and arming others. And they spoke loudly and clearly. And that's a diverse set of allies of America. And for whatever reason, some of our greatest allies abstained in that Security Council vote and have been silent in allowing Iran to potentially avoid the arms embargo that has been placed upon it through the UN Security Council. It's as if those allies that are so key to us in the region, their voice means nothing. And frankly, because of the maximum pressure campaign, the tough diplomatic work of the likes of Ambassador Haley and Brian's extraordinary efforts around the world, those countries spoke up and spoke loudly and clearly. But for whatever reason, their voices are lost. But they know the true threat and danger of an armed Iran, whether a nuclear armed Iran or a conventional weapon armed Iran. And let's not doubt for a moment that American troops suffer as a result of that. Iran has been killing American troops for many, many years. One of the great oppositions to the JCPOA was the killing of Americans by Iran. I think that arms embargo, there will be undoubtedly, if it expires and arms are transferred one way or the other, it will lead to the death of Americans. We all had the ability to stop that. The administration spoke loudly and clearly, and even some of our best allies that are permanent members of the Security Council abstained, which I thought was gravely unfortunate. Some of the mischief makers at the UN opposed it, not a surprise. That's because of the changing world that we're living in. So with that, let's talk about the arms embargo, and let me introduce a great friend of mine, and in my mind, the most knowledgeable man who has worked behind the scenes on Iran in the most patriotic of ways, Norman Roule, who was the intelligence manager on Iran for far longer than I want to say on a public forum because it will age him. But he knows Iran, loves Iran in many ways because of the culture and the people, and can speak fluently on it, and is an expert really on the weapons transfers that are at issue today. So with that, I get to introduce my friend Norman Roule. Norman, I turn it over to you virtually, and I hope to see you soon in person.
Good morning, and thank you, Mark, for that very generous opening. I'd like to provide a few comments and to show a very few number of slides to assist the viewers. May I have the first slide, please? Next slide, please. So Iran has repeatedly stated its intent to modernize its military system, especially in the areas of air power, missiles, air defense, and naval capabilities. Events have also pushed Iran to move in this direction. Its military deficiencies compelled it to rely upon the Russian military during the Syrian conflict. Likewise, Iran has expressed an interest in expanding its ability to project power in the Arabian Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the Red Sea, primarily because of its involvement in the Yemen conflict. Both of these conflicts have provided Iran with experiences that showed that its Revolutionary Guard and its regular military could better project power and support proxies if they only had more advanced weapons. In defiance of multiple UN resolutions, Iran has also provided its proxies with missiles and a variety of weapon systems. This campaign of weapons provision has not only increased the ferocity of the conflicts in the region, but has exacerbated their impact on innocent civilians from Yemen to Syria. But it's also compelled Israel to conduct hundreds of airstrikes to delay system delivery that would risk a conventional conflict in the region. Similarly, these systems have been used by the Yemen's Houthis to conduct attacks on Saudi Arabia that have not only exacerbated that conflict and threatened the kingdom, but it has threatened the lives of thousands, tens of thousands of foreign nationals who live in the kingdom. Next slide, please. So what would happen if Iran were to gain access to additional military? Well, I think we need to look a little bit outside of the area. Iran has the arms embargo currently prevents Iran from undertaking a lot of activities in the region for its weaponry, but China and Russia have historically and repeatedly stated that they would be willing to provide Iran with weapons, and they have done so in the past. Moscow and Beijing both look upon Iran as a way of limiting U.S. power in the region and Western influence in the region. Iran would represent a very attractive arms market to the Chinese and Russian weapons manufacturers. Let me give you just a few very brief examples of what Iran might require. Since 2016, Iran has publicly stated an interest in acquiring Russia's Sukhoi 30 fighters, which have been used extensively in Syria. And in essence, Iran seeks to acquire an air force to allow it to do in countries what it has done with Russia in Syria. Similarly, Iran bought J-7 fighter aircraft from China in the past and is seeking to modernize these to a new system, the J-10 or J-10C fighters. And this is an aircraft that would give it a performance capacity that's roughly equal to that of, say, an F-16 Fighting Falcon. Iran also operates Russian-built Kilo-class submarines, but it's not only looking to update these submarines, but may purchase Chinese Yuan diesel submarines, which are much quieter, or cruise missiles or missile capacity to allow it to undertake missile operations again in the Arabian Sea or water areas. This system in general would allow Iran to increase its power and to increase the type of systems it provides to its neighbors. I'd like to speak about its neighbors now. Next slide, please. So Iran's neighbors are currently going through a series of unprecedented financial pressures, and they're all seeking to reduce their military budgets. Iran's acquisition of new weapons will make it very difficult for these countries to reduce their budgets, and they'll actually have to look at acquiring new deterrence and defense programs, particularly in the areas of air defense and offensive missile capabilities to have that deterrent, counter submarine activities, and other very expensive systems. I should also note and close with this comment that we've seen Iran use its missiles not only directly against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and provide missile capacity to Lebanese Hezbollah and to the Houthis, but as this missile production and its use increases throughout the region, we're facing the growing prospect of a missile race in the region, which would be hugely expensive and would divert resources from badly needed social programs and would significantly destabilize the region to develop a missile race. Russia has responded, as well as China, that they're willing to sell weapons to Gulf states and to other states. So in essence, you have Russia and China being willing to provide the weapons that would foster this military race throughout the region. At a time when the region's stability is on the verge of so many important social and political changes, the last thing we need is an arms race that would upset this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Norman. Obviously, very, very helpful. And what's an incredible takeaway for me, and Norm and I have discussed this many times, is look at Iran's mischief in the region during the times of the arms embargo. Imagine Iran's mischief in the region without the arms embargo. And I think you would see that the potential for violence, death, and harm to both the United States and its allies is incredibly great. One point of note, those that are seeking to ask questions, if you would type in your messages and we will try to get as many of the questions to the panel as possible. I think some of you all are raising your hand as I'm looking virtually across the many participants. It's now my pleasure to introduce Special Representative Brian Hook. Brian, it's hard for me to call you Special Representative, not for a lack of respect, but you're an old friend and somebody I know very, very well. And it's my great pleasure to introduce you, Brian. Brian is about to leave, this is your last week, I think, Brian, right? Or you're about to leave. I want to thank you on behalf of everyone for your service. You've done an extraordinary job. For many of us, it was a dream to apply maximum pressure on Iran, and you were the one that did it, proved the thesis, and did it better than any of us could have ever imagined. And Brian, this isn't Brian's first rodeo, as they say. Brian was the Assistant Secretary of State of International Organizations and has been an advisor to so many, including to me, and I've been very, very fortunate on that. Brian, we thank you for your service, truly and profoundly. It's been an incredible time, and we look forward to working with another friend of ours, Elliot Abrams, in your role. And Brian, we need to have a virtual coffee and catch up when you're done and hear about your future, because we wish you the best. But let me introduce you for your remarks now, Special Representative Brian Hook.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Wallace. I appreciate that. Mark and I were colleagues in the Bush administration, which is really nice to have this kind of virtual reunion. But then I also very much miss working with Ambassador Haley and with Norm Roule, who served with enormous distinction in the Trump administration. I think the first briefing I had when I was in policy planning on Iran was from Norm Roule, and he had already achieved a fairly legendary status in the executive branch for his expertise that Mark talked about earlier. And then I remember Ambassador Haley at the UN. She really elevated Iran as a thought leader. And I remember her coming down to Washington to what we call the petting zoo at DOD that has a display in a warehouse of all the Iranian weapons that have been interdicted in places like Saudi Arabia and Yemen. She created a great policy platform, I think, for people to increase their understanding of the threats that Iran presents to peace and security. So I'm looking forward to having her thoughts. I thought I might give a little bit of an overview on what we've been able to achieve over the last 3.5 years. When the president came into office, he ordered a complete policy review of our Iran strategy. And after doing a deep dive on that, we reversed it. And I remember it was in May of 2017 in a principals committee meeting where where the president's team agreed on a new strategy. And it was going to consist of maximum economic pressure to deny the regime the world's biggest sponsor of terrorism and anti-Semitism. Let's don't forget that. To deny that regime the money they need to execute on its mission set. We're going to diplomatically isolate Iran. The days of us telling our partners and allies in the region to share the Middle East with Iran were over. Standing with the Iranian people, and also putting in place the credible threat of military force to defend our interests. Those were the policy inputs that we had put in place. We have been executing against those policy objectives ever since. So let's take a look at the results that we've been able to achieve. Let's start first with denying the regime the revenue through our maximum pressure campaign. In December 31st, President Rouhani said that our American sanctions have cost the regime $200 billion. So we have been, I remember when President Trump got out of the Iran deal and the commentary it said that America alone would be a very ineffective America because you needed, all of the multilateral sanctions architecture. We proved that America alone is much more effective on sanctions than even the multilateral sanctions regime that preceded us. So we have been very effective on that. When we got out of the Iran deal, Iran was exporting 2.5 million barrels of oil a day. If you look back to a Reuters story in May, they reported that Iran exported 70,000 barrels. So that's 2.5 million to 70,000 barrels. And so Secretary Pompeo said that we're going to zero out Iran's oil exports. That's their chief source of export revenue. And where does that revenue go? It goes to the IRGC, it goes to the Quds Force, it goes to Iran's missile program, its nuclear program, all the malign activities that have caused so much misery and bloodshed in the Middle East. If you don't go after the oil, it's very hard to make any difference on Iran's foreign policy and on a lot of its malign activity. I remember when Secretary Pompeo gave a speech after the president left the deal, and he said to the Supreme Leader, you face a choice. You can either come to the table and negotiate a new and better deal, or you can manage economic collapse. The Supreme Leader decided to choose the latter. The IMF recently reported that Iran is the third worst performing economy in the world. They're only ahead of Libya and Venezuela, and that is not great company. The real has lost 70% of its value, and it continues its decline. And this is the consequence of major foreign investors fleeing the Iranian market. We've made very clear to the global business community that when you do business with Iran, and UANI understands this so well, when you do business with Iran, you never know if you're supporting business or terrorism. Defense. I remember when we came into office, Iran's defense, its military budget had reached record levels. And that was thanks to the sweetheart Iran nuclear deal that gave them massive sanctions relief and a lot of cash. So the Iranian regime spent that money the way they usually spend it. I'm very proud of the fact that during our time in office, we have reversed that. So if you look at Iran's 2019 military budget, down -28, and that includes a 17% cut to the Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iran's proxies are also weaker. When you put their banker, their central banker, in a state of perilous finances, it has very positive second order effects. And so I've seen a number of stories. There was one yesterday in the New York Times, but there's been other stories over the last year or two by the Times and the Post documenting how Iran's proxies are weaker because the Iranian regime doesn't have the money that it used to. And this matters in places like Lebanon. Prior to 9/11, No non-state actor had killed more Americans than Hezbollah. The Iranian regime midwifed Hezbollah. And when we came into office, they were spending $700 million a year supporting Hezbollah. That's 70% of its budget. And I remember it was last year in March, Ben Hubbard in the Times did a front page story documenting how Hassan Nasrallah, the leader, had to undertake a fundraising drive. And we saw little banks, people, Hezbollah asking for people's spare change in grocery stores, and billboards asking people to support with donations. And so it's a very good thing when Hezbollah has to resort to a fundraising drive to keep its operations going. That is one sign that our economic pressure is working. We have restored deterrence. That was lost under the Iran nuclear deal. Obviously, the president's decision to take down Qasem Soleimani when he was planning attacks on Americans. We had the International Maritime Security Initiative that's been operational now for some time. That has disrupted and deterred a number of attacks on maritime attacks that Iran otherwise would have launched. You know, during the Iran nuclear deal, 2015, 2016, the IRGC Navy and the Iranian Navy, there were 56 incidents of harassment of American naval ships. And when we came into office, we made it clear we're not going to tolerate that. And those incidents have gone down dramatically. And President Trump threatened that we will blow up these boats if they violate international maritime rules and start harassing our ships. We've enhanced our force posture in the region, and the president flowed another 15,000 troops when Iran started to increase its kinetic activity. We've also increased the number of our interdictions of weapons that otherwise would have made their way to the Houthis in Yemen that would be used to attack Saudi Arabia. The other thing that we're seeing, and this is a consequence of, I think, of our very successful strategy. You may remember in 2014, there was an Iranian official who bragged that Iran controls Baghdad and Damascus and Beirut. And today you see an entirely different story. Prime Minister Khatami is off to a very good start, trying to really tether Iraq to the Arab world and to diminish Iranian interference. And the Iraqi people want the same thing. You see in October, massive protests in Lebanon against Hezbollah and the Iranian model. And you also see, I think Iran and Syria has become much more of a burden than an asset to Russia and Syria, because we're never going to get to a post-conflict scenario in Syria for as long as Iran is using Syria as a forward deployed missile base to attack Israel. In Iran itself in November, worst protests in the 41-year history of this regime. We stood with the Iranian people from the day we started. And I was very proud of the fact that during those protests in all 31 provinces, there were no protests against the United States, against President Trump, or against our sanctions. They were aimed squarely at the regime. And this is another example of how a number of experts got this wrong. They thought that us leaving the Iran deal would cause the Iranian people to rally around the regime, and it was quite the opposite. Last thing I'll mention, we've also stood with Israel in a very unqualified way as they defend themselves against Iranian aggression. And so that's the right policy. And I'll close with sort of one other observation. I've talked about the policy inputs and then the results that we've been able to accomplish as a consequence of getting the strategy right. But when you get your Iran strategy right, it also creates a better environment for other good things to happen. And you saw that on Wednesday last week when we were able to broker a peace agreement between the UAE and Israel. When you have the wrong Iran strategy, it is impossible to get peace agreements between Gulf nations and Israel because they don't trust you. And there's no question that the nations in the Gulf and Israel viewed the Iran nuclear deal as a betrayal. And by coming into office and reversing that policy very quickly, we restored trust. And that was a necessary precondition to being in a position to get a peace agreement signed as we did on Wednesday. So we're going to keep at this. This is the right formula. You have to have economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, standing with your allies, and the credible threat of military force. And as a consequence, we've achieved historic results. And the President, Secretary Pompeo, all the team, Ambassador Haley deserves so much credit for this. I'm very happy that Elliot Abrams is going to be taking over. That's an upgrade on this file. Obviously, he's just got an amazing history working in the Middle East. And so over the next week or two, I'll be handing over the file. It'll be in very good hands. And I look forward to the Q&A session coming up.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Brian, very much for the remarks. It's my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Nikki Haley, who really doesn't need any introduction. I haven't had the privilege of working much with Ambassador Haley over the years, but I know of her career. She was a distinguished governor of South Carolina, but I do know the UN, and I saw what she did at the UN. And Brian mentioned this in his remarks, Ambassador. I haven't had the chance to convey this to you directly, but you really did elevate the Iran issue at the UN, and your voice, the dignity, the respect that you showed everyone at the UN, and the way you comported the United States at the UN really made our voice loud and clear for a just cause, calling out Iran for what it is. And for that, our country will be forever indebted to you. And it's a real privilege and honor to have you on this webinar. And we look forward to some of the answers to questions that we'll be having here.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's great to be with you. I'm a massive fan of UANI, and I just have to say, Senator Lieberman's such a cool guy. So it's great to just be with him. The information from Norman Roule, I mean, he knocked it out of the park, and I can't say enough good things about Brian Hook. I mean, what a patriot. And he really just fought the good fight the whole way. It's going to be a loss for America to see him leave the administration, but it was such a pleasure to work with him on all the things that matter. And we can't stop. And UANI is a great way to keep doing that, is we have to make sure that we never turn our eyes away from Iran, especially as we're talking about this arms embargo.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ambassador Haley. And I think you really hit the nail on the head saying that Senator Lieberman is the coolest guy. We're all lucky. We can't match the cool factor of Senator Lieberman in any way. With that, hopefully we'll launch a few questions now and look forward to our answers. And we're taking questions online. We already have some in, and I'll start feeding those into the system now if that will work for all of our production team. Brian, if we could start off with you. There's a lot of talk about the snapback sanctions and what's been going on at the UN under Security Council Resolution 2231. But give us a little bit of insight. You and I both served at the UN. What are our allies, our closest allies, saying behind the scenes when the UK, France, and Germany abstain on an arms embargo? What is striking to me is that 5 years ago, under the deal, if somehow Iran changed its behavior, presumably they would have supported lifting the arms embargo to reward Iran. Now Iran isn't honoring the deal, engaging in mischief in the region, and they're not supporting, and they're opposing, an arms embargo on Iran. What are our closest allies saying to you, Brian, and how can they justify what they are saying?
Well, the UN is, of course, an important multilateral body, but on the case of the arms embargo, it's not the most relevant. The most relevant multilateral body is the Gulf Cooperation Council. And you mentioned this earlier. I think Senator Lieberman did, or you may have, Mark. The Gulf Cooperation Council is in the 4th year of a very tough rift. And they came together for the first time since the rift started in June of 2017. Yeah. And they demanded that the Security Council extend the arms embargo. And the UN Security Council has the responsibility for international peace and security. They need to listen to the region. They need to listen to the countries that are on the front lines of Iranian aggression and not substitute their judgment for the judgment of those that are closest to the danger. And so this was a very big disappointment. I think it was a big loss for the council. This was an important test and the council failed. I don't know who in 2015 thought it was a good idea to let an arms embargo expire on the Iranian regime. This is a regime that killed 603 Americans, directly responsible for the murder of 603 Americans in Iraq. That's 17% of the total casualties. And of course, when you take that number, you can multiply it in terms of the people that have been injured, many permanently. And I think the theory of the case, is in year 5, the moderates would be in charge. I mean, the world's most famous unicorn is an Iranian moderate in government. It just doesn't exist. And so we never got seduced by this trap of trying to empower moderates. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're in the regime, you're a hardliner. And of course, the regime has this veneer of democracy. It sort of has this Westphalian storefront. But when you look in the back office, it's run by the supreme leader. And he's the one that makes the decisions. It doesn't matter what happens about these sham elections in Iran. And so it's a big disappointment to see the council do this. We made it very clear that we can do this the easy way or the hard way. We can either pass an arms embargo, or we can proceed to snap back and make the arms embargo go into place that way. Unfortunately, a number of countries just weren't able to see this very clearly. Some are still trapped in the Iran deal. And the Iran deal today is more form than substance. But there are many countries that still, whenever they look at the Middle East, they look at it through their JCPOA lenses. And it gives a very distorted view of the region. We've put in place the right policy. It's been very successful. President Trump would like to see those that are still in the deal to join him in what has been a very successful foreign policy against Iran.
Thank you, Brian. One quick follow-up to Brian, if I could. There's been a lot of talk about, is the deal a lot dead here? Or is the administration trying to kill the deal? The deal really is gone. It's been overtaken by events. I mean, the deal that was struck in 2015, whether you agree with it or not, was done in a snapshot in time. And there's all this talk about going back into the deal or not back into the deal. But the deal today does no longer exist, because it would embolden Iran. You'd have to go back in with small arms transfers and the like. What do you say to those that say that it's possible to go back into a JCPOA right now?
Well, the Iran nuclear deal starts expiring in about 60 days, and it's going to continue to expire. People forget this. This is a temporary and modest non-proliferation agreement that gave Iran a pathway to a nuclear weapon. And so in that way, it very much resembles the 1994 agreed framework with North Korea. It's sort of the same diplomacy, and you had some of the same diplomats work on both. And so if anybody wants to know how the movie ends with the Iran nuclear deal, if we didn't get out, you only have to look at North Korea. So by getting out of the deal and pulling forward the expiration date, that's really how Secretary Pompeo describes it. This deal was going to expire. We pulled forward the expiration date because if we had waited, Iran would be richer, its proxies would be richer, they would have retained their nuclear infrastructure, they would have retained enrichment. And so one of the things that I think people forget, I get this question, oh, it seems like since you've left the deal, Iran is closer to a nuclear breakout. The question illustrates the problem. When I was in the UN Security Council, when Mark was there, we negotiated a prohibition on enrichment. That's the right standard. We have to restore the UN Security Council standard of no enrichment. And if you look at the Secretary's list of 12 demands, no enrichment is at the top of the list. And if we can get that done, and we have put in place the leverage necessary to do it, it moots the question of how close Iran is or isn't to nuclear breakout. And if you concede the fundamental point on enrichment, that sets off a nuclear race in the region because everybody else wants enrichment. Now, I will applaud the UAE. They're now in their 10th year of having a civilian nuclear program with no enrichment. But once we did the Iran nuclear deal and we go around the region and say to some countries, we'd like to have you follow, the UAE model, the answer is no, I think we'll take the deal that you gave Iran. And we don't have a good answer to that. The answer needs to be, nope, we got rid of enrichment. You want civilian nuclear power? That's not a problem, but there's no enrichment.
Thank you, Brian. No, I agree. It really was a nuclear cooperation agreement plus a little bit more in 2015, and not a very good one at that. it had some real flaws, notwithstanding the good intentions. So often we heard people saying, let's kick this problem, let's kick this can down the road, kick this problem down the road. And regrettably, that is not the way, in my opinion, to conduct foreign policy. You're right, North Korea is Exhibit A. Ambassador Haley, you were in that Security Council dealing with our Russian and Chinese friends all the time. Give us a little bit of insight into your observations about China's opposition to this, the lifting of the support of the lifting of the arms embargo. What's in their mind? What could we do differently? Was it ever a viable possibility that Russia and China were not going to oppose our efforts at the UN Security Council?
You know, I think, Mark, it was obvious that they were going to oppose it. You know, what was not obvious is that the Europeans were going to oppose it. And I think what you have to look at is China and Russia are rushing to get the business from Iran because they know that they're going to want to buy weapons. And we also know what they're going to do with it. The thing is, Russia and China would love nothing more than to see Iran continue to say death to America, continue to say death to Israel, and continue to have the weapons to threaten us with that. You know, but what we have to look at the fact is, while disappointed as we are about the Europeans and the way they have responded to this, we have another set of allies that we didn't always have. We now have Arab countries who know the threat of Iran, who know what it means, and it's their region. They're telling the world Iran is dangerous. They're telling the world that Iran is funding these proxies. They're telling the world that they don't want this arms embargo to go away. They want to make sure that we extend it out. They want to make sure that if we don't, that we put sanctions on it. And I think that's the part of what, you know, this administration started year one with that Arab meeting that was so important. And the idea that the Emiratis, the Israelis, and the US came together last week, huge move in terms of a threat to Iran. Having other countries follow, I think that that's going to happen, and it's going to continue to weaken Iran in the process. But we can't turn our eyes away from what Iran is trying to do. And I think that we also need to look at, why did the Europeans oppose us? The Europeans didn't oppose us because they think we're wrong. The Europeans opposed us because they've always been a part of a multilateral group. You know, whether it's the EU, that they're always doing everything with the EU. At the UN, they think that it's better to be part of a multilateral deal than it is to, even if that deal is flawed, even if that deal is not being followed, they want to make sure that they are a part of something, because they don't want to lead. They don't want to stand alone. And so they didn't want to be, if to them, they saw it as if there was no deal, then Iran was a bigger threat. That's just not the truth. And so I dealt with the Europeans there, especially on the Iran deal, when we were getting out of the Iran deal. And it was fear that drove them. It was fear of, but if we get out of the deal, what will Iran do to us? Well, that's not how you lead. That's not what we do to stay strong. What we do is we let Iran know we're onto them. We continue to weaken their economy. We continue to put sanctions on, and we continue to work with our Arab partners and our other allies that realize the threat of Iran. And the Europeans will come along. They'll come along late, which is what they do, but they will eventually come along.
Thank you, Ambassador. One follow-up to that. What would you say to businesses, trade delegations, and the like that might see an opportunity of whether in the arms area or in other businesses that see perhaps there's European support or Russian or Chinese support to do business in Iran? The maximum pressure campaign that has been largely unilateral, which seemingly is a bad word, has worked. But what would you say to those businesses that might see this and go back into Iran? Is it viable for them? What do you say as a former lead American diplomat to international businesses that would seek to go into Iran?
You know, I would say don't do it. Don't do it. It will absolutely backfire. Iran doesn't know how to be a partner with anyone. All you have to do is look in Syria and see what a pain they've been to Assad in Syria, what a pain they've been to Putin in Russia. Iran is going to use anyone that will let them use them, and they're going to use it for bad. So if you want to do business with Iran, then be prepared to explain why your weapons were used by Hezbollah to harm innocent individuals. If you want to do business with Iran or China and Russia, make sure that you're willing to explain how things happened in Israel, or how our allies were hurt, or how American soldiers were killed because they had additional weapons. That's what this means. Anybody that does business with Iran, including China or Russia, will need to be called out, because Iran is not going to do any good with the weapons that they're given. They didn't do any good with the big load of money that they got. They're not going to do any good with these weapons. And anyone that chooses to be irresponsible in dealing with Iran or China and Russia in their process to help Iran, they will end up regretting it. And it will absolutely backfire in the process.
Thank you, Ambassador Haley. Norman, let me throw really a two-part question to you, if I could. We've all mentioned the import of the GCC, and Brian really made this point quite well, that the GCC has not really gotten along and worked collaboratively on many issues. It has been largely divided for years. And were historically quiet on being outspoken on Iran. Two things have occurred of late, as Brian articulated. They've been willing to be more vocal, and they were united in their opposition to Iran and the arms embargo. Can you give us a little bit of the context, because of your incredible knowledge and perhaps service in that region? I think we're not allowed to talk about that service, but can you talk to us about what your perceptions are of those countries and the consequence of their being more vocal, their being united, and what actions they could potentially take? That's part number one. The second part, I wanted to get into your former work and tell us, it seems like there's been a lot of mischief afoot where the Iranians engage in ill behavior, but there's been seemingly some retaliatory measures of sabotage, perhaps groups inside of Iran, almost a strategic proportionalism, where Iran engages in something bad and then something bad happens to Iran. Comment, if you would, on the concept of that proportionalism, and perhaps messages that are being sent to Iran that if they engage in bad behavior, that they will suffer consequences that are both economic, influential, and informational, but also perhaps kinetic, with things blowing up in places where they should blow up.
Thank you, Mark. Those are great questions. So let me begin by saying that the Gulf Cooperation Council states, as well as Jordan, as well as Israel, all see themselves quite reasonably as victims of Iranian aggression. And this is a choice Iran's leadership made after the Iran nuclear deal. Whatever your views are on the deal, Iran did not have to undertake this aggression on the region. And the aggression is on a historic scale. The number of missiles and armed drones that have been launched against Saudi Arabia, this is Iranian technology and training, exceeds any number of missile attacks a state has undergone, at least since the Iran-Iraq War, and possibly since the Second World War. These states are often in a position where they're being told to de-escalate against Iran. But if you ask the leadership of these countries to stop doing things against Iran, they usually respond with the question of, what do you want us to stop doing? Stop catching Iranian missiles? Stop uncovering Iranian weapons caches? One of the largest explosive caches in Middle Eastern history was found in Kuwait, placed there by Lebanese Hezbollah, funded by Iran. So for the Gulf states to pull together, it's not actually surprising in that they are all, at one time or another in their history, and certainly in their future, based on the history, going to be victims of Iranian aggression. And I think that's often lost in Europe and in the United Nations. And that's unfortunate, because these institutions were created in the United Nations to protect those states against aggressor countries. Regarding threats Iran may face internally, I will say two things. First, bad luck tends to happen to bad people doing bad things. There's just a truism that goes through this. And countries that engage in such behavior need to expect that other countries may respond. And this is very dangerous, because again, escalation can take place. And you don't want to be flippant about this, but you've got to consider that countries cannot stand by while an aggressor state simply builds capacity to undertake operations. The lesson I think you should take from this entire picture right now is the region itself feels that it is a victim, and the international community is not sufficiently standing with it against an aggressor. And the danger, therefore, becomes if they feel they're alone, they will undertake operations on their own. And that's very dangerous for international stability.
Thank you, Norman. Always insightful. Brian, let me follow up really to Norman's point to you. You recently engaged in at the administration with your leadership, Brian, engaged in an extraordinary operation to intercept Iranian gasoline and fuel oil. It sounds like you know more. It's been a little bit unclear to me. That was headed to Venezuela. What do you think Iran will do in response to that? We've already seen their interactions that were unlawful at best, perhaps piracy in the Straits on another vessel. Do we expect Iran to retaliate? And do you see Iran, talk to us about Iran's role with Venezuela. I mean, mere fact that they're trying to interfere in Venezuela in sort of our neighborhood, if you will, really shows that their international adventurism is designed to harm interests and cause instability around the world. Talk to us about that Iranian-Venezuelan relationship, if you could.
These are two pariah states that have found each other, and they're both in a very bad place. You remember I mentioned earlier, two of the worst performing economies in the world are Iran and Venezuela. Because of our maximum pressure campaign, Iran needs money, and because of our pressure campaign on Maduro, he needs fuel. And so they found a marriage of convenience here. The relationship between Iran and Venezuela goes back to the days of Hugo Chavez. So obviously, we believe Maduro is illegitimate, and he's been very bad for the Venezuelan people. One could say the same for the Iranian regime. So we saw this plan to try to deliver a lot of fuel to Maduro from Iran. There were 5 Iranian flag tankers that did make their way to Caracas. We immediately sanctioned the 5 ship captains. There were some other boats that were non-Iranian flagged, and they were operated by somebody outside of Iran. And so my team moved very quickly to strip the flags of those vessels. And then we made very clear to the ship owner that there would be very significant downsides if we see a lack of cooperation. And so working with a number of our interagency partners, we were able to take possession of the Iranian fuel. This is a big loss of revenue to the regime. It also is a bad outcome for Maduro. I think for 2 years now, Secretary Pompeo and I have spoken directly to the maritime community about the dangers of doing business with Iran. When you move Iranian oil, you're funding terrorism. So I look at it as oil for terrorism. And so we have really isolated Iran, and they have a very hard time moving oil or fuel these days, because Iran has become a no-go zone in the maritime community. And that's a very good thing. That is part of collapsing Iran's oil exports, which, as I said earlier, is their chief source of revenue. So not only have we done our sanctions, we've enforced them. One of the great things about working for President Trump is he enforces his red lines. And so when we say, that we're going to bring Iran's oil to zero if they don't come to the table, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to enforce this with a lot of strength. This is something which the prior administration had sanctions, but they weren't very well enforced. I think the business community, UANI has done very good work on this across administrations. They've made very clear to the business community the dangers and the risks of doing business with Iran. I remember Stuart Levy worked on this when he was at Treasury. This was continued by UANI during the prior administration. And now in this administration, we've made enforcement a really big priority. And that's allowed us to really achieve the results we have of taking Iran from 2.5 million barrels down to 70,000.
Brian, maybe one follow-up if I could. Could you discuss the importance when you stop a foreign vessel from offloading oil in Iran, you're not just preventing the sale of that oil. Iran has a serious problem of storage capacity and operating its hydrocarbon supplies. Can you talk about the importance, if you will, of foreign vessels that are not NIOC vessels, which are mostly floating storage now, the importance of them not offloading oil in Iran and creating capacity for Iran to continue to pump?
One of the things about Iran's oil sector, Mark, as you described, so much of their oil is in floating storage. I think it was a few months ago that we saw reports about wells being shut in, and it makes it very hard to get those operations back online once they've been shut in. And so Iran at this point has a hard time giving away its oil. Obviously COVID has contributed to the depressed prices in Brent crude. But at the same time, this is like what Norm said earlier, bad luck, what did he say? Bad luck happens to bad people. Look, we had in place a very tough sanctions regime and we enforced it. And then when you had then the downturn in the global energy markets, it really compounded and aggravated the isolation that Iran is feeling in its energy sector. So that's been a big help. The other thing I'd mention is that for as long as we were in the Iran deal, we also couldn't do any of Iran's financial sector. And so Iran is one of the world's leading centers of terror finance and money laundering. We came in and blacklisted scores of Iranian banks. Then you had the SWIFT financial system match all of our designations. Then you also had FATF come in, and that's based in Paris. They now put in place countermeasures to deal with Iran's lack of transparency. Since '79, Iran has deliberately run an opaque financial sector so that people can't follow the money. That's how it's designed with all these IRGC shell companies. At least half or more of the Iranian economy is run by the Revolutionary Guard Corps. So by going after the banks the way that we had, that's part of the maximum pressure campaign that's been successful.
Thank you, Brian. Ambassador Haley, you've done such an extraordinary job of being the calm, reasoned voice of strong principles, really that has reached both Democrats and Republicans. And we can't ignore, as strong as we've tried to be bipartisan over the years, and it used to be that the Iran file was one of the most bipartisan areas of foreign policy. Brian remembers that, Norman remembers that. Regrettably, and it's not through direct fault of anyone, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, you had to choose. You were either for it or against it, and that created and cleaved political divisions. Do you think it's possible, considering that Elliot Engel and Mike McCall recently drafted a letter on the arms embargo that was signed by all, many members of the House of Representatives, is it possible for the Iran issue to become more bipartisan, perhaps after the election? And what would you say to your friends across the aisle as they invoke their own concepts and policy regarding Iran?
You know, I think it's tough because, the one time that we did see great bipartisan support was in opposition to the Iran deal in the beginning. It's the reason why Congress took actions and allowed for, to make sure that if it was still a threat to U.S. national security, that the president could make that decision to get out of the deal. So they both, both sides disagreed that the Iran deal was good to start with. It's unfortunate that we're starting to see Menendez and Cardin and all of those suddenly now oppose us going into the snapback sanctions and opposing us on that front. So it's hard to see that we're going to get back to that bipartisan support. I think, the more we move away from the Iran deal, the more that we push our allies, it seems like the Democrats are going to be more upset about that. But I think that what you're going to see is even after the election, we have to figure out a way to deal with Iran. They're not going to go away. We look at China as being a really big threat. It's a different kind of threat. They do it very much by way of, whether it's trade or whether it's through cyber attacks or some other things. Iran is not as sophisticated as China. And so they very much will pay off proxies to do things. They will try and do cyber attacks. They'll be messy. They will continue to try and do those things. And that's what really needs to bring forward a bipartisan effort to say, the one thing that we should all agree on is Iran is a threat. They're not going to go away. And we've got to do anything and everything to stop them from gaining any revenue that's going to allow them to build up their nuclear production or allow them to buy arms. We've got to make sure that we look at their human rights record. We look at their ballistic missile testing. We look at their support of terrorism, all of those things. We have to keep the pressure on them, and we can overcome what's happening at the UN, because no one thinks that Iran is a good actor at the UN. That's the thing, is none of them think that they're actually doing what they want to. It's just they're working out of fear of not knowing what's happened. One of the best things that happened is when Soleimani was killed. He was the absolute strategist behind who to kill, when to kill, how to kill. And the idea that he was done away with really left the Ayatollah flat-footed, left their strategy somewhat in limbo. And we have to seize on this time to continue to weaken them through the snapback, continue to weaken them through making sure that we don't allow oil to move, continue to weaken them by strengthening our relationship with our Arab partners in the region. There are ways that we can actually make Iran even weaker than they are today, but we can't let our guard up. And the last thing we need Iran to see, or China or Russia for that matter, is to see the US divided, especially when it comes to this. So while it's hard to see that we can get back to a bipartisan effort, we've done it once before, and I think our goal should be, we've got to figure out how to do it again.
Thank you, Ambassador Haley. It wasn't that long ago, Ambassador Haley, that if we talked about a vocal coalition of Arabs, Israelis, and Americans across the front opposed to Iran's regional adventurism, nuclear ambitions, that people would have said you were dreaming, that will never happen. But that's the reality that we find ourselves in today. How can we get to the place where that extraordinary coalition, a real coalition, is emphasized domestically and politically, when I think most Americans understand that the threat of a nuclear Iran and Iran's behavior in the region is incredibly dangerous? What do we do to be a loud voice to the American people to underscore that now there's many public servants that are on this call. We've achieved, Brian's achieved, Norm has achieved, you've achieved the coalition that we all dreamed of, which is Arabs and Israelis and Americans, Iran's neighbors, who would never speak in the past. How do we convey that to Americans of all political persuasions and say, look, we've made enormous progress in this region. Peace could break out in this region if we could align ourselves and be focused on Iran, and we were united as to our policy on Iran. What do you say to convey that to the American people and elevate that topic in such a charged political environment that we have now?
I think we can't emphasize enough the deal that happened last week. That was just so huge, and it's a great beginning. If we go and we pull in the Emiratis, if we go and pull in the Egyptians, if we go back and look at Jordanians and Israel and bring them together, there is a group here. What I would love to see is to have President Trump go back and have that same meeting he had his first year. Meet with the Arab partners again in the name of fighting terrorism, but this time we're meeting with the Arab partners in the name of fighting Iran specifically. This is a time of great strength. This is a time to show that there's a lot of good that can happen when we all come together. And I think our Arab partners are ready. They've felt the wrath of what the Iranians can do. I mean, many of the panelists have said it today. Saudi Arabia has had to deal with so much of it, and anyone that has dealt with Hezbollah or Hamas, or any of the proxies that they have done, the Houthis in Yemen, they all know that Iran is behind this. And so I think right now we emphasize what happened with the Emiratis. We encourage the other Arab countries to come along and join the Emiratis in this coalition. And then to see the president get together with the Arab countries again would be absolutely huge at continuing the fight that we've already started.
Thank you, Ambassador Haley. Norman, one of the things that we haven't mentioned in this webinar is the issue of breakout time, which was always used to argue that the JCPOA set back Iran's nuclear program some period of time, a year or more, rather than a potentially very nascent and quickly evolving nuclear program. Some of the explosions that have happened in Iran of late, what's in your sense, your assessment of where the setbacks that have happened at some of their facilities, has that setback breakout time in any material way? What's your assessment of the impact of those explosions on Iran's breakout time?
No, that's an important question. So to begin, I want to say I don't know if an outside factor was involved in those explosions, for the record. And without even commenting on that issue, I think the most important takeaway from this is if indeed an external actor was involved in that explosion, then the most significant impact on the breakout time is actually a decision by Iran's leaders. They have to, in essence, say to themselves, if I build a program, will I be able to build it successfully and take it to execution before an external actor finds out about it and responds, perhaps in a conventional manner? So I think these actions send a message to Iran's leadership that they can't get away with nefarious activity. Now, this said, the amount of destruction that has taken place, Iran is not published. Iran has not let it known what type of systems were involved. Iran generally exaggerates its advanced technologies and focuses on its more proven technologies. So at this point, I think it's easy to say the timeline has been set back. It's likely that Iran's leadership understands that they need to really think carefully about undertaking a nuclear weapons program and thinking they can get away with it. But that doesn't mean that they won't at some point decide to do so. And that maybe is the final line of it. It's set it back. But once again, as long as Iran believes the international community is not unified in compelling constraints on its nuclear program that are meaningful, real, and long-term, the thought will probably remain in the back of the head of at least some of their hardliners that such a nuclear weapons program is possible.
Mark, can I just add one thing to that?
Absolutely, please do.
Iran, for now over a year, has been refusing requests from the IAEA on both access to suspicious sites and also refusing to answer questions about hidden activities. And so some of that is a consequence. Israel pulled off a very courageous and very daring raid into Iran, where they uncovered an atomic archive in a warehouse in Iran that was undeclared to the IAEA. And that's 1/2 ton of materials that the IAEA and other countries have been going through. And of course, this naturally leads to questions that the IAEA would like to ask Iran. And Iran isn't answering the questions. And so we very much support the role of the IAEA in insisting on it. Now, we had a board vote in June, and it was 25-2. Calling on Iran to be transparent with with UN nuclear inspectors on both answering questions and on access. I remember, I think it was in the first year of the administration, Ambassador Haley and I went to the IAEA. She met with the Director General, then Director General, to talk about how much we support the IAEA's work. And now it is as critical as ever, with Iran playing cat and mouse with UN nuclear inspectors. We're going to continue to press Iran for that. But this is one of the, it was really good to see the 25-2 vote because one of our pillars, as I talked about earlier, is diplomatically isolating Iran. And we see the international community making very clear that Iran has to come clean in a way that they didn't under the Iran nuclear deal and start answering questions and giving access.
Our last question before we go to Senator Lieberman for closing remarks. As Brian is a sitting government official and on his way out, the point of privilege will go to Brian for the last question. Now, Brian, I don't want to put you on the spot, but we can't ignore that there is an election about to happen. And we have many friends on the other side of the aisle. You know, and I know many of our colleagues, and we call them personal friends. Let's assume somebody was from Vice President Biden's team who was sitting with you, Jake Sullivan. And Jake Sullivan were sitting here. What would be the message that you would say to Jake Sullivan as to your experience in dealing with Iran now? And should they be have the fortune of having an administration elected and President Trump not being reelected, what's the message you would want personally to say to Jake or somebody like Jake in the role and experience that you've had during your time there? So I don't want to put you in the spot, but what would you say?
Well, the first thing I'd say to Jake is that we're hopeful about a second term. The second thing that I would say to Jake is regardless of where you stand, you know, at some point there is going to be future administrations. We hope that that's after 2024. It's very clear that you've got to get your Iran policy right if you want to make progress in the Middle East. And if you have the wrong policy, it leads to all sorts of violence in the region. I mentioned earlier, it would have been impossible to broker a peace agreement between UAE and Israel if they feel like you betrayed them with the wrong Iran strategy. It's not possible. There's just no trust there. So you really have to, I think, the sort of my lessons from this period is that the biggest threat that our allies and partners in the region face is not the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, it's Iran. You've got to start there. And then after Iran, it's like the Muslim Brotherhood, it's extremism on both Sunni and Shia, it's jobs, right? It's all these sort of basic things. But on the security side, because Iran is the biggest driver of instability in the region today, you've got to get that right. And I think that's a universal, it should be a bipartisan issue. You talked about making this bipartisan. I was very pleased that the House of Representatives had almost 400 signatures. It was a letter to Secretary Pompeo saying we have to extend the arms embargo. That's the American spirit, right? You've got to stand up and counter Iran. The Iran deal, I get it that it was well-intentioned, but it failed. It failed to deter Iran, and it did not address the problem of Iran's nuclear program. So that's what we need to do. We have put in place enormous leverage for a second term to get the kind of outcomes that we're going to need. In this case, you know, deal or no deal, our pressure and isolation and defending ourselves has been very successful. The president would like to get to a deal. Whether we have one or not, this policy that we have in place needs to continue. It just needs to run like a river. And if we get to a deal, fine, but if we don't, this is the kind of policy that makes the Middle East more peaceful and stable.
Thank you all very much. And it's I get to have briefly introduced my friend Senator Lieberman, who have closing remarks. Truly, no one has been dealing with this issue, fighting Iran and preventing the danger of Iran from spreading around the world and ultimately impacting the United States, and my friend Senator Lieberman. And I wake up every day looking forward to speaking to him and working collaboratively on Iran. So I'm a lucky guy. Senator, for you to close.
Mark, Ambassador, thank you very much. The feelings are, of course, mutual. Thanks to Brian Hook and Nikki Haley and Norm Roule. I think this has been an extraordinary discussion. It's been informative, it's been illuminating, and I think it gives us some work that we know we have to continue to have to do in the months ahead. Excuse me, I draw this conclusion, and I'm not unbiased, but I think my eyes are clear here. The Islamic Republic of Iran regime is at its weakest point in its almost 41 years of rule. That's because of the increasingly strong position of the US in regard to Iran. It's because of the growing closeness between the Arab nations and Israel, which, as we said, excuse me, the strength of the US position enables. It's also because of the growing awareness and courage of the people of Iran that they simply cannot tolerate the corruption and incompetence and repression of this government that has seized their country and held them hostage. So I think we're at a time of maximum opportunity with regard to Iran, and we have them on the ropes. And it would be a tragedy if for some reason we stepped back and gave them time to revive themselves, or even threw in the towel. And I would say letting the arms embargo elapse would effectively be stepping back, in a boxing metaphor, and letting them revive themselves to come back to the center of the ring and start not just punching, but killing us and our allies. I think the possibility of going back into the JCPOA or rushing into a new agreement would be a tragedy, a colossal strategic mistake that would effectively be throwing in the towel so that Iran can be victorious. Even now, as I say, they're on the ropes. And if we continue to apply the pressure, I'm optimistic that this regime in Tehran will collapse. I will say a word as a Democrat about how we reconstruct the bipartisan consensus on Iran. 5 years have elapsed since the JCPOA. Iran has done nothing to earn a rapid re-entry by the US into that failed and flawed agreement, or a rush into a new agreement that is not strong. The fact is that the region has changed. Just look most visibly at the UAE-Israeli agreement last week. So I think, and this is not something that has to be done out of loyalty to Barack Obama. It's not Barack Obama's Iran anymore. It's not Barack Obama's Middle East anymore. It is so clearly in the national bipartisan interest of the United States that Iran not just be contained, but if possible, that this regime be overthrown by its own people, or in the natural momentum of events that are going on now, it be allowed to collapse, just as the Soviet Union collapsed a few decades ago. So we've got a lot of work to do in UANI and in American government and politics. October 18th is a big day. The day the embargo will cease unless we continue it. And then November 3rd, Election Day, is another important day, and one between now and then, I think we all have a responsibility to talk to candidates in both parties to ask their commitment on this critical question. So thanks to the panelists, thanks to you, Ambassador Wallace, thanks to everybody who's joined. Wonderful response to this. And I think you've given us all a little bit of momentum as we leave this webinar this morning. Take care. Have a good day.
Thank you, Senator. I just was receiving a programming note. I've always wanted to say a programming note. You will be able to watch this recording later, and stay tuned for obviously future events that we hope to hold virtually. And everyone, please stay healthy and safe. And thank you all for participating.